And welcome back to Devlog. In the last part, I replaced both of my lungs with 2 slabs of pulled pork in order to gain pulled pork powers. As you can probably surmise, this is going very well, and I have achieved porkiness.
And in this part, I work on the enemy logic for swimming fish enemies. The way fish enemy works is pretty simple because all enemies in my game are very simple, but they have one differentiation from other enemies, being that fish enemies can actually move. The fish enemy has 3 different states: an idle state, an alert state, and a swimming state. The fish does not automatically see or be alerted to the player. The fish has to actually detect when the player is within range of them, and then will come swimming towards them. This is because the fish is faster than the player and is more aggressive than the player, so if the fish is always chasing after the player, it would be too much of a difficult hazard for the player to actually identify and avoid in levels. Because of this, the fish has an idle state and an alert state, where it is doing nothing and then it is alerted to the player. The way this works is very simple. We have the enemy at all times checking how close the player is to the fish. If the player is within a certain distance, the timer for the fish's alert timer will tick down. If the player is further away, it will tick back up to whatever the default of this timer will be. Let's say it's 5 seconds. We also check if the player is in the water, because the fish will not actually detect the player unless they are underwater. This is mostly to avoid situations where the player has just respawned, they're standing aside next to the water, and then fishes are already being alerted to them and are coming up close to the water surface to try and bite at the player. This is obviously something I want to avoid because it just makes replaying certain sections very annoying when fishes are always going to be predisposed to being alerted to the player. I only want the fishes to be alerted to the player when they are in the water, because I only want the fishes to be a hazard in the water. I did have an idea for fishes to be able to jump out of the water and land on land and then flop about on the surface, but I didn't feel like adding this because there are not enough circumstances in the level design that really accommodated for this movement to even be possible. It would be a fun touch to maybe add this in the future, to have some kind of system for fishes to flop around on the surface, but as for now, no. Fish movement is very simple. If the player has been alerted to the fish will trigger into their alert state. This is just counting down a timer and playing an animation until they actually move. We create an effect for this. This is very simple. We then enter the swimming state. All this does is we tick our momentum value to be whatever our fish speeds would be based on an accelerated amount. This means the fish has a natural acceleration to their movement. It's not just they see the player, they start moving at top speed. They build up to their top speed. The top speed is actually a lot faster than the player can actually swim, but they accelerate very slowly, so if the player has alerted fish to them, they have a pretty sizable opportunity to avoid the fish before they actually become a hazard and start influencing the player's movement in the level. And by influencing the movement, I mean killing the player and meaning they can't move any longer. The actual movement for the fish is just that they will rotate towards the player and they will move forwards. This is very simple. I rotate the fish towards the player. I like this method of enemy movement because it means the fish is always moving forward relative to its forward, and it looks kind of funny when they have to turn around really sharply, and they cannot do that for they are pretty slow at turning. I also add an override for if the fish is upside down when it is moving. This is pretty simple. If the fish is facing upside down, then it is upside down. All I do in this state is I flip the Y scaling of the fish so it is no longer upside down. I also trigger a animation for this, for the fish actually squishing a little bit, to give some visual feedback for the player to actually see the fish is flipping and not just have the player think that the fish is being scaled to flip it. There is an actual visual feedback to give the impression of the thing actually turning. It's the same method I use for the player turning when I just -1 scale of the player to flip them. I also play an animation that gives the impression of it actually flipping, in opposed to just me altering one of the scales from a -1 to a 1. The opposite then happens if the fish is scaled in the opposite direction. I flip this back to a +1 if it is a -1. Next we have the animations of the fish. Mwah! Once again, I absolutely nail it. First try with animations. The first animation we have is the fish's idle animation. This is the fish dopily swimming around when the player has not alerted the fish. It blinks one eye at a time because it is of a low intelligence. I like this animation a lot. It looks dopey, it looks silly, it really conveys the personality of the little fishies that I have drawn. They look silly and dumb. The next animation is the fish being alerted to the player. A little exclamation pops over the fish's head. They open their jaw a little bit and then very quickly transition into their swimming animation. Their swimming animation is them biting periodically. Their eyelids are rotated to be a lot more angry. They flip their little flipper on their butts and they do a little bite. This also makes an animation play, and by an animation play I mean a visual trigger, and by a visual trigger I mean an audio trigger. The player makes audio when the fish swims, and by the player makes audio when the fish swims, I mean the fish makes audio as it swims and bites. I have a cognitive problem. The fish makes audio as it swims and bites with each biting effect. This is very simple. I overlaid a chomping sound effect with a metal banging sound effect to give the impression of the fish's metal aggressive biting. This animation plays faster the fish moves, and the fish moves, the faster it proceeds to swim. So the more the fish swims, the faster it proceeds to go towards the player. The faster this animation plays, the faster the audio is played out, the more and more intimidating and aggressive the fish appears to be. We next have the chomping animation. This is the fish actually biting down on the player, so whenever the player touches the fish, it bites down like this and then goes back to its dopey little idle pose, because the player is dead. We also have a flipping animation. This is just a scaling squash and stretch of the fish to play whenever the fish needs to be scaled. Altogether, I really adore the animations for the fish. Considering I actually made the animations first before I drew the visual for the fish, I just drew the outline of what I was hoping the fish would look like. I am a big fan of how the animations actually look once I have a real visual for the fish to go along with them. I'm a pretty big fan of how they all look. Animating this little dopey little fish was very fun. It has not a lot of different moving parts. A lot of the main detail of the fish is in its lower jaw and its eyelids, so I had a lot of fun adapting the limitations of its sprites to work with a animation for this little fishy. Finally, we have the visual for the actual fish. I drew this morning. I am a big fan of how this looks. He looks like a dopey little mess. He looks rotting, he looks gross. I love him so much. He has little wrinkles on his forehead, he has little warts on his chin, his teeth look moldy and rotting. I want to give the little fishy a big old kissy. I'm a big fan of how it looks. It has a weird little squished little face. If I remove the eyeballs, you can see it has a little goblin-y based head where it has a really overarching brow like a Neanderthal. It looks about as dopey and stupid as I really hoped the fish would designed to be. In terms of enemy designs that I have made for Pep-Pellington, I'm a big fan of the fish. I really enjoy the enemy variety in Pep-Pel. I like that every single area has its own little enemy variants, and even though the aquatic abode only has one enemy variant because I didn't want to draw more fish, I'm a big fan of how it actually looks. The intended difficulty of the aquatic abode is not to have a whole lot of different enemies, so having this one I think is really, really fun. It just occurs to me that this is the exact same shapeage and colour as the clay cottage levels enemy, that being the stop motion little clay eyeballs. Mayhaps they are related, mayhaps. I will write about that in the Pep-Pellington lore book, but I probably won't. I think I just have an affinity for dopey looking purple blob enemies. And that's it for Devlog. Pep-Pellington is, as you can tell, almost pretty finished with the design for the aquatic abode level, which is what next devlog's video shall be about. The aquatic abode and the aquatic abode's levels have been very fun to design for and also make, and mostly draw. But more on that next devlog, where I talk about the water level, my current favourite level. Not to brag or anything, but the water mechanics in Pep-Pel kind of rock.